The wind came down off the San Juan Range that afternoon with a low, animal sound, and the sky over the pasture went the color of wet slate. A woman in a long gray wool dress and a faded blue apron stood at the edge of her hayfield with her sleeves buttoned to the wrist, one hand shielding her eyes, the other pressed against the small of her back. Her name was Hannah Ruth Blackwood. She was 31 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years and 11 months. And in about 40 minutes, if the sky did what the sky was telling her it would do, the last of her cut hay would be ruined where it lay. She did not know yet that a man was already riding toward her from the low road below the cottonwoods. She only knew the storm. Ethan Calloway was 34 years old, 6 feet even, dark-haired, with a jaw a week shy of a shave and eyes the color of creek water in autumn. He wore a long canvas coat gone soft at the elbows, a wool shirt the color of old bricks, dark trousers, and boots that had walked more country than most men saw in a lifetime. He had lived in Durango 3 months. Before that, he had lived in a small stone house outside Pueblo, and before that, in a place he did not speak about. He had come north because a man he had once ridden fence with had written him a letter that said, "There is honest work here, and there are people who could use a hand, and the mountains are good for a quiet mind." Ethan had folded the letter twice, put it in the inside pocket of his coat, and mounted a bay gelding named Judge, and he had not looked back at the Pueblo road. He had ridden past the Blackwood place 4 times in 3 months. He knew the fence line. He knew the barn was leaning half a hand's width east of True. He knew there was a woman who lived alone there, because the town in its kind, careless way had told him so. What he did not know, until he came around the low bend that Tuesday afternoon in September of 1889, was that she was small and quick and stubborn, and that she was trying to move 600 pounds of loose hay by herself with a storm coming down out of the mountains at the speed of a bad decision. He reined Judge in at the road. He watched her for perhaps 10 seconds. He did not call out. He simply swung down, tied Judge to the gatepost, and walked into her field with his coat already half off his shoulders. She saw him then. Her mouth opened as if to say something firm. He got to the nearest bundle before she got the words out. "I helped her carry hay before the storm," he would say later, months later, to the man who eventually asked him how it started. He would say it flat and quiet, the way he said most things. "That was all. I helped her carry hay before the storm. She quietly changed my life forever." But that afternoon, standing in the field, all he said was, "Where's your barn door?" She pointed. He nodded once. And they worked. Now, before that hay is inside those walls, you should know a little more about Hannah Ruth Blackwood, because a person's history is the ground their present stands on, and the Blackwood ground was neither smooth nor soft. She had come west from a small town in Ohio in the spring of 1881, with a husband named Samuel and a hope that Colorado would be kind to a woman with quick hands and a strong back. Samuel had died in the winter of 1886 of a fever that arrived on a Tuesday and left him gone by Sunday. There had been a child, once a boy, born too early in the spring of 1884, who had lived for 4 days and been buried under the young cottonwood at the west corner of the yard. Hannah did not speak of the boy. She did not need to. There was a small wooden marker under that tree, and every April she pulled the winter grass back from it with her bare hands. She kept the ranch. 40 acres, 12 head of cattle, a milking cow named Prudence, 3 laying hens, and a barn that leaned. She made her own soap. She sold eggs and butter in town on the 2nd Saturday of every month. She read the same 3 books on the same 3 winter evenings each week, and she did not, as the good women of Durango sometimes suggested she should, remarry, because she had loved Samuel Blackwood the way certain still creeks love certain still stones, and she did not know how to love a second time, and she was not certain she wanted to learn. She rose at 4. She fed the chickens by 5. She had the cattle counted and the milking done and the fire built up by 6. She kept a small ledger on the kitchen table in Samuel's careful hand for the first year after he died, and then, in the spring of '87, she took a fresh pen and she started keeping it in her own. The columns balanced. They had, every month of every year, balanced because Hannah Blackwood was a woman who did not permit a column not to balance. That was the shape of her days. The shape of her nights, which is a different matter, she did not speak of, even to the widow Callens, even to herself. That was the woman standing in the hayfield when Ethan Calloway walked into it. They worked for 37 minutes. Neither of them spoke, past the small necessary words of shared labor. Here, left side, wait. He carried the heavier bundles. She stacked the lighter. The wind picked up in the 4th minute and picked up again in the 12th. The first fat cold drop hit the top of her bonnet in the 31st minute. By the 37th, the last armful was inside the leaning barn, and the sky broke open behind them like a poured pitcher, and they stood in the barn's dry mouth breathing hard and not looking at each other, because neither of them yet knew what looking at each other would mean. She turned first. She wiped her hands on the front of her apron. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You're welcome." She said, "Have you eaten today?" He had not eaten since a strip of jerky at first light, but he was not a man who admitted to hunger in another person's house. He said, "I'm fine." She looked at him a moment longer than a stranger looks at a stranger. Then she said, "Come to the kitchen." "Ives tu?" "Samuel's coat is by the door if you'd rather dry." She said his dead husband's name that easily, the way a person says the name of a room. Ethan did not remark on it. He nodded. He followed her across the yard through the sideways rain, and he did not touch the coat by the door, because a man does not put on another man's coat in another man's house, even if that man has been gone for 2 years and 11 months. He sat at the table. She ladled stew. They ate. They spoke of the price of oats and the state of the road to Pueblo and the leaning of the east wall of the barn, which he had noticed and which she had known about for a year and a half. He did not ask about the wooden marker under the cottonwood. She did not ask where he had lived before Pueblo. When the rain slackened, he stood. He said, "I'll come back tomorrow and set your east wall true, if that suits." She said, "You don't owe me that." He said, "I know." He walked out to the gatepost. He untied Judge. He mounted up. He did not look back at her porch, though she stood on it a moment longer than the weather warranted, watching him ride out. He turned onto the low road under the cottonwoods, and the last of the September rain hissed thin against her shake shingle roof, and he was gone. That was all that happened on the Tuesday. But a woman who has kept a ledger balance for 3 winters alone knows, sometimes, when a new column has quietly been opened without her hand, and Hannah Blackwood, closing the porch door behind her, felt that column open, and she did not name what it was for. Now, the thing about a man like Ethan Callaway is that he did not announce himself. He did not, in the days that followed, ride up to the Blackwood gate with his hat in his hand and a speech in his mouth. He came back on Wednesday morning with a bag of tools and a length of milled oak from the yard in town, and he set the east wall of the barn back onto its foundation by the middle of the afternoon. Hannah watched him from the kitchen window for the first hour. Then she brought him coffee. Then she went back inside and made a second pot, and she made bread, and she stopped at the window 3 more times before dusk. She could not have said, if asked, what she was looking for at that window. Only that she found herself walking to it, and finding a reason to be near it, and standing longer than she meant to before turning away. On Friday, he mended the pasture gate that had been dragging its lower hinge in the dirt since the spring of Samuel's last year. He worked slowly. He worked well. Hannah brought him a plate of cold beef and buttered bread at midday, and he thanked her the way a man thanks a woman who has fed him, quietly and without extra words. On Sunday, after the church he did not attend, he was there before the sun was fully up, splitting the winter's wood in a stack against the north wall of the house. He did not knock at her door. He simply worked. And when she came out with a plate of eggs and biscuits at the 3rd hour, he took it and he thanked her and he kept splitting. She stood on the porch that Sunday and watched him bring the axe down clean, over and over, with the low sun laid gold across the yard, and she felt a thing she had not felt in 2 years and 11 months. She did not name it. She went back inside and she stirred the fire and she picked up her mending, and her hands were unsteady, and she was 31 years old and a widow, and she was not, she told herself firmly, going to be foolish about a man who had shown up in a hayfield. That is the first thing to understand about the season that followed. Ethan Callaway did not court Hannah Blackwood. He worked for her. He did not ask her to marry him. He built a stronger fence along the north pasture. He did not tell her he loved her. He replaced the rotted step at her front door on a Tuesday morning she was not home to see. He greased the hinges on the barn door, one at a time, on a Thursday evening when the sun went orange behind the ridge. He carried a new axe handle up from Durango because he had noticed hers was cracked at the throat. And each of these things was, in its way, a sentence in a letter he did not know how to speak aloud. By the middle of October, the cottonwoods along the creek had gone the color of struck gold. By the first week of November, the first hard frost had laid its hand on the north pasture, and the milking cow's breath came white in the morning. Ethan had been at the Blackwood Ranch in one capacity or another, 4 or 5 days a week for 2 months, and the town of Durango had begun to notice. The town of Durango, being a town, had opinions. The town was not unkind. It was simply Durango. There was the widow Callens, who had known Hannah since she came west, and who watched from her post at the mercantile with a small still smile and said nothing to anyone. There was old Robert Hayes, who ran the feed store, and who had been half in love with Hannah's mother 30 years ago in Ohio, and who now watched Ethan buy penny nails and milled oak and shake his head with a kind of amused approval. And there was Marcus Doyle, who was 38 and a widower himself, and who had, in a slow and patient way, been calling on Hannah Blackwood for the better part of a year. Not urgently, not badly, just Sundays after church with a covered dish and a careful conversation about the weather. Marcus was a decent man. He was tall and clean-shaven, and he owned 120 acres east of town, and he wanted, in his careful way, a wife. He had not pressed Hannah. He had waited. And now there was another man's axe ringing against the wood at the north side of her house on a Sunday morning while Marcus rode up the road with a covered dish, and Marcus, being a decent man and not a foolish one, saw at once what he was seeing. He did not turn back. He rode all the way up. He tied his horse. He tipped his hat to Ethan Calloway at the woodpile. Ethan tipped his hat in return. Marcus went to the door. Hannah opened it. Marcus said, "I brought a pie." Hannah said, "Come in, Marcus." And that was the beginning, though nobody standing on that porch could yet have named it, of the small quiet reckoning that would set the whole thing in motion. You see the shape of it now. You see how it had to move. A woman who had loved once and buried it. A man who did not know how to speak. A patient, decent neighbor who had waited a year for a Sunday that was quietly, in that very moment, being taken from him without a raised voice. And a town watching. I want to pause here for a breath because I want to tell you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from tonight, that this story is not about who won. It is about who saw. So if you're inclined, tell me in the comments what country you're watching from, and let's keep company for the rest of it. Because now the season had to turn. The turn came on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of November, and it came not as a declaration but as a window. Ethan had ridden up mid-morning with 2 panes of good glass strapped carefully to the flank of his packhorse. He had said nothing to Hannah when she came out onto the porch. He had only said, "Kitchen windows cracked on the east side." "Been meaning," she said. "Ethan, it's been cracked since Samuel was alive." He said, "I know." He worked through the afternoon. He measured. He squared the frame. He fitted the pane. He cut the sash cord clean and set it steady. He sealed the edges with a strip of milled pine and a bead of white lead, and he stepped back, and he looked at his work, and he did not say another word about it. And when Hannah came into the kitchen at the 4th hour, the low November sun was coming in through the new east-facing window and laying itself across the pine table in a bar of clean gold, and she stopped in the doorway and put a hand against the frame, because she had not, in 2 years and 11 months, seen good morning light in her own kitchen. She said quietly, "Ethan." He was standing by the doorway with his cap in his hand and his coat still on, because he had not, in the whole of the 3 months he had been coming to the Blackwood Ranch, set foot inside her kitchen unless she had first invited him. He did not look at her. He looked at the bar of gold light laid clean across the pine table. He said, "I built it east-facing, so you'd have good light. In the morning." She did not answer. She could not. She turned her face toward the window, and she stood very still, and after a moment she said, "Thank you." And she went outside onto the porch, and she stood with her back to the house for a full minute before she came back in. That was the thing about the way Ethan Calloway loved a woman. He did not say it. He faced her house east. That night, alone in her kitchen, Hannah Blackwood sat at her pine table under the new window, and she cried for the first time in 8 months. Not for Samuel. Not for the boy under the cottonwood. For a thing she had not let herself want in almost 3 years, and for the shame she felt at wanting it, and for the great unearned gift of a stranger who had known, without being told, that she needed morning light. She sat with her hands folded on the pine, and the kerosene lamp low, and the new window black behind her, and she let the crying come in the way a person lets weather come, quietly, without argument, until it had said what it needed to say. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. The next Sunday, Marcus Doyle rode up as he always did, with a covered dish and a careful conversation ready. Hannah met him at the porch before he could dismount. She said, "Marcus, would you walk with me a moment?" And they walked, the two of them, down through the pasture in the November cold to the fence line at the north edge of the property, where the wire ran straight along the creek and the cottonwoods stood bare against a hard blue sky. She stopped at the fence. She put her hand on the top wire. She said, "Marcus, you have been the kindest neighbor a woman could ask for." He looked at her. He was not a stupid man. He said, "But," she said, "but." She did not say the rest. She did not need to. Marcus Doyle stood at that fence line in the November cold with his hat in his hand, and he was quiet for perhaps 20 seconds. And then he said, "And here is where the story asks something of you, because he said it well, Hannah.
Ideupat.
I won't pretend I hadn't hoped. And I'll tell you plain, I think I'd have been good to you." He paused. "That's not nothing. I'd have been good to you." She said, "I know you would have, Marcus. I know that." He was quiet another beat. He looked out across the north pasture and back. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, and it did not ask for pity. "I've been up that road most Sundays for the better part of a year. I've thought about it on the ride. I've thought about it after. That counts for something in a man's own house, even when it doesn't count in someone else's." She said softly, "It counts, Marcus." "It does." He said, "Is he good to you?" She said, "He built me an east-facing window." Marcus Doyle stood at that fence a moment longer. He looked down at the top wire. He looked back up. And he said, with as much dignity as a man can carry in a hard moment, "Then he understands you better than I did. And I hope he knows what he has." He set his hat back on his head. He said, "I'll not trouble you again on a Sunday, Hannah, but I'll tip my hat in town. And I mean that kindly." She said, "I know you do, Marcus." He walked back up the pasture alone. He did not eat the pie. He rode home. That is what a decent man looks like when he loses. Remember that, whoever you are watching. A person's dignity is what they carry out of a room they were asked to leave. Now understand. Nothing had yet been said between Hannah Blackwood and Ethan Calloway. Nothing. There had been an axe on a Sunday and a window on a Thursday and a stew on a Tuesday. There had been coffee brought out 3 times a week. There had not been a word spoken that a stranger could have hung a name on. That was going to change on the first Saturday of December, at the town social in the great hall behind the church with half of Durango watching. The town social was an annual thing. Fiddles. A long table of pies and preserves and roasted things. Lanterns strung along the rafters. Hannah Blackwood had not been to a Durango social since the winter Samuel died. She had not intended to go this year. She had, in fact, told the widow Callens on Wednesday that she would not be there. But on Saturday afternoon, with a soft snow beginning to come down over the yard, she had taken her second-best dress out of the cedar chest. A long-sleeved, high-necked wool dress the color of dark moss, and she had brushed her hair back and pinned it, and she had walked out to the barn where Ethan was foddering the cattle. She had said, "Ethan, would you take me to the social tonight?" He had turned. He had looked at her a moment. He had said, "Yes." He had ridden home to his small rented room over the livery. He had shaved. He had put on his one good shirt, the color of dark wine, and his one good coat, the long charcoal one, and he had come back for her in a borrowed wagon at the 6th hour, and they had ridden into Durango in the falling snow with the lanterns of the great hall glowing yellow at the end of the road. They walked in together, and the room, in the way rooms do, went quieter by a hair's breadth for the length of a single fiddle note, and then it went back to its noise, but every soul in it had marked it. Marcus Doyle was there, at a table with his sister and her husband. He looked up. He nodded across the room to Ethan Calloway. Ethan nodded back. Marcus lifted his glass, an inch, and drank. That was all. They danced twice. Ethan Calloway had not danced in 11 years. He was passable. Hannah did not care. They ate. They sat with the widow Callens for a spell, who patted Hannah's hand under the table and did not say anything, because she had already said everything she needed to say the day Hannah walked into the mercantile that October and bought 2 yards of ribbon for no discernible reason and blushed when asked what for. Somewhere near the 8th hour, old Robert Hayes came by their table with a plate of hot bread and set it down between them and said, "Miss Hannah, Mr. Calloway, long night ahead. Eat." And he walked off before either of them could thank him, the way a man walks off from a thing he does not wish to be thanked for. And at the 9th hour, when the fiddles had gone quieter and the lanterns had begun to burn low and half the town had gone home, Ethan Calloway walked Hannah Blackwood out of the hall and down the wooden sidewalk to the wagon. The snow had stopped. The stars were out over the San Juan Range. He handed her up. He climbed onto the bench beside her. He did not, at once, take up the reins. She said, "Ethan." He said, "Hannah." He said her name for the first time. "Not ma'am. Not Mrs. Blackwood. Hannah." She said, "Why did you come into my field?" He said, "There was a storm." She said, "There have been storms before. Men have ridden past." He was quiet a while. Then he said, "I saw you. And I thought, that is a woman doing a hard thing alone. And I thought I'd rather help her carry hay before the storm than ride past and be a man who rode past." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, quietly, "You quietly changed my life forever, Ethan Calloway." He did not answer. He looked down at the reins in his hands. He said, after a long moment, "That's what I'd hoped to do." He drove her home through the snow. The runners of the borrowed wagon cut 2 clean lines behind them in the fresh fall. Neither of them spoke, but neither of them wanted to. There is a kind of silence between 2 people that is not empty. There is a kind of silence that is a room that has finally been given a door. That was the silence in the wagon on the road home. At her porch, he did not come inside. He tipped his hat. He said, "I'll see you Tuesday." He rode back to town. 2 days later, on the Tuesday, he did not come at the usual hour. He came at first light. He came with everything he owned tied to the packhorse behind him. A canvas bedroll, a leather trunk not much bigger than a Bible, a coil of good rope, a bag of tools, and a small tin box that held, if you had asked him, the only things in the world he could not have replaced with a week's wages. He tied Judge to the gatepost, and he walked up the porch, and he took his hat off, and when Hannah opened the door in her long gray dress with her hair still loose from the night, he said, plain and quiet, "I'd like to speak with you at the fence line, if you'll walk with me." They walked. They stood at the north fence in the pale winter sun with the cottonwoods bare above them. He said, "Hannah Ruth Blackwood. I've $42, a good horse, a set of tools, and no land. I've a past I'll tell you about tonight by the fire if you'll have me tell it. I'll not be a rich man. I'll be a working one. I'd like to be your husband, if you'll have me. I'd like to face this house east with you for as long as we're given." Hannah Blackwood stood at the fence line and she put her hand on the top wire and she looked out across her 40 acres, at the leaning barn he had set true, at the pasture gate he had mended, at the split wood stacked clean against the north wall, at the small wooden marker under the cottonwood where a boy had been laid down in the spring of 1884. She looked back at Ethan Calloway. Her eyes were wet. She did not look away. She said, "Yes, Ethan. I'll have you." That was the fence line where 2 futures met. They were married on the 2nd Saturday of January, 1890, in the small church in Durango, by the same minister who had buried Samuel Blackwood 4 years before, and who had baptized a boy who had lived 4 days, and who now, with a hand steady on Ethan Calloway's shoulder and a hand steady on Hannah Blackwood's, said the words as if he had waited a long time to say them. The widow Callens sat in the second row with her gloved hands folded on her black wool dress, and a look on her face like a woman who has finally lived long enough to see a thing set right. Robert Hayes stood at the back in his one clean shirt. Marcus Doyle was there. He stood in the back beside Robert. He tipped his hat when they came down the aisle. Hannah met his eye and nodded once. He nodded back. That is what a decent man looks like when he watches a good thing happen without him. There is a spring in that country, when the cottonwoods come back in green so pale it looks silver, and the creek runs high and quick with mountain snowmelt, and the mornings arrive early through east-facing kitchen windows. That was the following April. Hannah Calloway, for that was her name now, stood in her kitchen at the 6th hour, with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, in the long bar of clean gold morning light. Ethan was already out at the north pasture, mending a section of the fence line the winter had shifted. She could hear him faintly, the sound of the mallet, steady. She stood at the window. She watched him. She was 32 years old. She was a wife. She had, that very week, quietly told him that she believed, perhaps, that there would be a child by the autumn. He had not said anything for a long moment. Then he had gone outside, and he had stood at the small wooden marker under the cottonwood for a long time, with his hat in his hand, and when he had come back inside, his eyes had been wet, and he had said only, "Thank you, Hannah, for letting a man like me stand in a house like this. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east." She lifted her tin cup. She drank her coffee in the morning light. She thought of a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1889, and a storm coming down out of the mountains, and a stranger who had walked into her hayfield without being asked, and had carried her hay before the rain, and had, in that plainest and least announced of ways, walked into a life she had not known she was still capable of living. I helped her carry hay before the storm. She quietly changed my life forever. Now, if you have stayed with me all the way to this porch and to this window, and to this bar of April light on a pine table in a house in the San Juan country, then I want to say something to you plainly before we part. There will be, in your life, a hayfield. There will be a storm coming. And there will be a moment, brief and unglamorous, in which you can either ride past, or tie your horse at the gatepost, and walk in, and lift what needs lifting without being asked and without announcement. Do not ride past. Whatever the field, whatever the storm, do not ride past. The people who quietly change our lives forever are almost never the ones who arrived with a speech. They are the ones who saw a hard thing being done alone, and stepped down and helped and did not require thanks. Be that person if you can, and be watchful for that person because they are already quietly riding past your gate. You may be looking out a window this very evening at the small ordinary work of someone who has been trying, for months, to say a thing they cannot say in words. Look again. Look kindly, and when it is your turn, and it will be your turn, do not ride past. Thank you for keeping company with me tonight, out here in this quiet corner of the Old West. If this story sat with you the way it sat with me, stay a little longer. The next one is already saddled up. A story about a widower in the high country who left a pair of good boots on a stranger's porch and never signed his name, and the woman who spent the whole of a hard winter trying to find out who they belonged to. Come back for that one. Until next time, keep riding.